Hey everybody, welcome to my video where I turn this scrap wood into a one-of-a-kind bookshelf. So I found this pile of scrap wood sitting on the side of the road one day and thought instead of letting it go to waste I could make something useful out of it. These boards have been sitting outside for who knows how long, but they've been preserved by this white paint. My first step was to remove this paint with my thickness planer and get down to clean wood. I then run the boards through the joiner to get at least one clean and straight edge. I'll cut the other edge off later on the table saw. Instead of pushing the boards all the way through, I like to cut it halfway and then flip the board long ways and cut the other half. This makes these cuts easier to handle and also ensures my fingers are far away from the blade. Then I cut the wood down to its rough length using the chop saw. I cut the full boards in half and then I'll glue them together later to make the shelf pieces. I use my biscuit joiner to put a few biscuits in between each shelf piece to make it a little stronger and prevent them from warping. When I have a bunch of edge grain that I need to glue up, I like to clamp all my boards together and spread the glue all at once instead of one by one. It saves me a bunch of time. These long boards will be the vertical pieces or the sides of the bookshelf, and I repeat the same steps I did on the shelf pieces. I let the glue dry overnight, and then I came back with the chisel and cleaned up any glue squeeze out. After removing most of the glue with the chisel, I ran the boards through the planer to get rid of the rest of the glue, and also to make sure there's no little bump where the glue joint was in between each board. After the planer, I run the boards through the drum sander, and I'm using 100 grit just to get rid of any bumps from the planer and to make the boards ready for hand sanding. Each pass through this sander takes a few thousandths of an inch off. After I sand the boards, I rank them based on how many knots they have or how many imperfections they have, and I also mark them to make sure that those imperfections won't be seen. Then I use the chop saw to cut the pieces down to their final length. The next step is to cut the slots in the wood where the shelf fits into the long side pieces. And I do a little test cut there on a scrap piece. The test run looked good on the scrap piece, so I moved to the real bookshelf, and I clamped both side pieces together so I could cut the slots at the same time. My router bit wasn't wide enough to make the slot in one pass, so I had to cut it about another 1/8 of an inch for it to fit the board. And once I did that, the boards fit in there snugly. The top piece is going to sit on the top edge of the wood, directly on it, so I didn't have to cut a slot for it like I did all the shelf pieces. Once I cut all the slots, I flipped the boards on their side, clamped them together again, and using a rabbet bit, cut a groove where the back, like the bookshelf backing, will sit in. I put a fresh blade on the table saw and ran all the shelf pieces through, just on one side because this side's going to be the side you see in the finished product. I found the flattest part on the shop floor, and this is where I started assembling the bookshelf. Then I add dowels to each side, just to add a little bit of strength and for aesthetics. And this method, using the syringe to squeeze in the glue, worked out really well. I didn't do this on the bottom because I'll have a molding piece that goes around the bottom, so it'll cover these holes, so I can just use regular wood screws for that. As I was sanding down the dowels, I noticed that the spacing between the top and the rest of the shelves was off. The top was a little bit longer, so I had to cut the top off a couple inches and then nail it back on. Now I'm adding a base molding. I didn't use much measurements here. Instead, I put the pieces of wood up to the bookshelf and then traced them, and ended up with exact cuts. I used my 1/4 inch chamfer bit to add a little chamfer to all the molding pieces. And this Milwaukee brad nailer came in handy for this project. Instead of having to set up the air compressor and a bunch of hose, I just got right to work with it. I don't know if I would use it in a professional setting if I was laying down bored all day long, but for a small project like this, it worked out perfectly. With the top and bottom molding pieces done, I ripped 2 thin pieces of wood to use for the side molding, and I run a quick chamfer down them and tack them in. all the molding on, that concludes the rough carpentry, and then we move on to sanding, finishing, and adding the back of the bookshelf. Sanding is my least favorite part of woodworking, and this project had a lot of sanding, so I decided to splurge and buy the Festool ETS EC150, hoping that it would make sanding a little bit more enjoyable, and it definitely did. Before, I'd been using a DeWalt 5-inch and a Milwaukee M18 5-inch sander, and compared to those, the Festool is a lot quicker, quieter, smoother, less vibration, and the dust collection is really good. They say 95% and above, and I definitely believe that. For the back of the bookshelf, I'm going to use some beadboard, and I clamped 3 sheets together and measured to get the beads lined up in the middle, and then cut all 3 sheets at once. Then I brought the bookshelf indoors to stain it. I used a coffee stain, and I just put it on really messy, and then I came back and got all the corners and edges, make sure I covered every inch of it. Then I vacuumed and used a tack cloth to get off all the dust. I would have just used an air compressor, but I don't have one here in my apartment. I'm using an oil-based polyurethane, and I ran it through a little strainer and mixed it about 50% with mineral oil. This makes it thinner and easier to apply. My original plan was to use beadboard for the backing and paint it. Still using the same beadboard pieces that I cut earlier, I just flipped them around and I'm using the back sides to put wallpaper on. I thought this would be a more interesting look, and if I change my mind I can always flip the boards around and paint them later. Then I almost cut my off. I paid extra close attention to maintaining the pattern so that it looks like there's just one piece of wallpaper used instead of multiple pieces. The roll of wallpaper I bought was perfectly sized so that one sheet could fit in between each open space, and then I could just hide the seam between the 2 wallpaper pieces with each shelf. Then we tacked the boards to the bookshelf using some tiny screws. I'm really happy with how this bookshelf turned out. Seeing that scrap wood turning into something so unique and functional is very satisfying. And that's a wrap on the DIY bookshelf project. I hope you enjoyed following along, and if you did, don't forget to like this video. And if you're interested in seeing more videos like this, please subscribe. There'll be plenty more to come. Until then, happy building.